It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. In a quiet countryside home, a conversation stirs that would set events in motion for the Bennet family.
My dear Mr. Bennet, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?
I have not.
But it is. Mrs. Long has just been here and told me all about it.
Do you want to tell me, or shall I guess?
Oh, you tiresome man. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England. Came down Monday, saw the place, and agreed immediately. His name is Mr. Bingley, and he's single. 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls.
How so? How can it affect them?
Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You know I mean for him to marry one of them.
Is that his design in settling here?
Design? Nonsense, but he may fall in love with one of them. You must visit him at once.
I see no occasion for that. Perhaps you and the girls can go, or better yet, just send them. Mr. Bingley might like you best of all.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, you flatter me. My beauty is long gone. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought not think of herself.
Indeed, when a woman has 5 daughters, there isn't much beauty left to think of.
Mr. Bennet, how can you say such things about your own children?
But Lizzie has a spark of quickness, I must admit. They are all silly and ignorant, like most girls. My dear, I only speak the truth. Jane is far prettier, and Lydia much more good-humored.
Lizzie, you always prefer her. 20 years, at least. You've reminded me of them.
Ah, my dear, I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends.
You have no idea what I suffer.
But I do hope you live long enough to see many more men with 4,000 a year move into the neighborhood.
What use would that be if you refuse to visit them?
When there are 20, my dear, I shall visit them all.
And so it was, in the Bennet household, that Mrs. Bennet made her mission clear to marry off her daughters, while Mr. Bennet remained ever the master of wit and sarcasm. Their differing temperaments promised a lively future. Despite his constant assurances to the contrary, Mr. Bennet was among the first to visit the new resident of Netherfield Park, Mr. Bingley. Yet he kept this secret until evening, delighting in the dramatic reveal. The sound of light stitching, the rustling of fabric, and occasional coughs in the background.
I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie.
Elizabeth pauses in her hat trimming, surprised.
We are hardly in a position to know what Mr. Bingley likes, Father.
Indeed, since we are not to visit.
But, Mama, we'll meet him at the assemblies. Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him.
Mrs. Long. Ha! She has 2 nieces of her own. She's a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her.
No more have I. I am glad you do not rely on her, my dear.
Stop coughing, Kitty. You're tearing my nerves to pieces.
Yes, Kitty, do time your coughs more discreetly.
I do not cough for amusement, you know.
When is the next ball, Lizzie?
Tomorrow fortnight.
And Mrs. Long will not return until the day before. She cannot possibly introduce him.
Then perhaps you may introduce Mr. Bingley to her, my dear.
Impossible. How can you tease so? I have never met the man myself.
Ah, a fortnight is indeed too brief an acquaintance. Yet if you decline the honor, I might take it upon myself to introduce him.
The girls exchange wide-eyed looks. Mrs. Bennet sputters.
While Mary gathers her profound thoughts, let us return to Mr. Bingley.
I am sick of Mr. Bingley.
A pity. Had I known this morning, I would not have called on him. But alas, it's too late. We are now acquainted.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, how good of you. I knew you'd come around. What a clever joke, going without telling me.
Indeed. And now, Kitty, you may cough freely.
What an excellent father you have, girls. How shall you ever repay his kindness? At our age, making new acquaintances is no small thing. But for your sakes, we do it all.
I'm sure Mr. Bingley will dance with me at the ball, even though I'm the youngest.
What makes you so certain, Lydia?
Because I am the tallest.
The rest of the evening was filled with speculation, laughter, and plans. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters eager for Mr. Bingley's return visit and the possibilities of the future. Despite her relentless questions, Mrs. Bennet could not pry from Mr. Bennet any satisfactory details about Mr. Bingley. The family was left to rely on Lady Lucas, whose report painted Mr. Bingley as young, handsome, agreeable, and fond of dancing. This sparked much excitement in the Bennet household.
If I can see one of my daughters settled at Netherfield, and the others married just as well, I shall have nothing left to wish for.
Footsteps as Mr. Bennet enters. Mr. Bennet, ever the secret keeper, had already visited Mr. Bingley, but the ladies only learned of the visit when he casually let it slip.
Ah, the blue coat Mr. Bingley wore when I met him was quite fetching, don't you think?
A stunned silence falls, then a chorus of gasps and excited chatter from the daughters.
You visited him? Oh, Mr. Bennet, you sly man, and you never told us.
Well, I had to be sure he was worthy of our daughters. A blue coat and a black horse do speak volumes.
The assembly ball, the sound of lively music, chatter, and the occasional scrape of dancing shoes on the floor. When Mr. Bingley arrived at the assembly with his party, the Bennets were ready to observe. Mr. Bingley's charm soon won over the room, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, did not fare so well.
Come, Darcy, you must dance. I cannot bear to see you standing about.
You know I detest dancing with strangers. Besides, there's not a woman here who could tempt me.
Well, aren't you just delightful, Mr. Darcy?
While Mr. Bingley danced with enthusiasm, Darcy's aloofness quickly earned him the title of the proudest man in the room. The sound of the door opening and closing as the family returns from the ball. Mrs. Bennet bursts into the sitting room.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, what a delightful evening. Jane was so admired, and Mr. Bingley danced with her twice. Twice!
Ah, if only he'd twisted his ankle during the first dance. Such mercy would have spared me this report.
And his sisters. So elegant. Their gowns were...
Spare me the lace details, my dear.
Then let's speak of Mr. Darcy. Horrid man. Imagine, Elizabeth, not handsome enough to tempt him? Such arrogance.
Perhaps we should thank him for sparing me the effort, Mamma.
Conceited and insufferable. I wish you had been there, Mr. Bennet, to put him in his place.
The Bennet household, later that evening. Quiet fills the house as Mr. Bennet reads his book by the fire. Though Mr. Bennet had hoped for disappointment, the evening brought the opposite. Jane was admired, Elizabeth amused, and Mrs. Bennet, filled with hopes for her daughters' futures, found much to discuss in the days to come. Mrs. Bennet, with the help of her daughters, tried every means to extract details of Mr. Bingley from Mr. Bennet. Yet he eluded their efforts, forcing them to rely on Lady Lucas's glowing report. Mr. Bingley was young, handsome, agreeable, and fond of dancing. Such news filled Mrs. Bennet with boundless hope.
If I could but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield, and the others equally well married, I would have nothing left to wish for.
Though Mr. Bennet had already visited Mr. Bingley, he had told no one. Even when Mr. Bingley returned the visit, he met only Mr. Bennet while the ladies spied on him from the upstairs window. Bennet's sitting room. The soft rustle of fabric as Jane and Elizabeth sit together, stitching.
He is just what a young man ought to be. Sensible, good-humored, lively. I've never seen such happy manners, so much ease with such perfect good breeding.
And handsome, too. A young man ought to be handsome if he can manage it.
I was flattered he asked me to dance a second time. I didn't expect it.
Didn't you? I certainly did. How could he resist? You were 5 times as pretty as any other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. But I give you leave to like him, Jane. You've liked many a stupider person.
Dear Lizzie,
You're too apt to like people in general. You never see faults in anyone. All the world is agreeable in your eyes.
I hope I am not too quick to judge anyone harshly, but I always speak what I think.
And that's what makes it remarkable. With your good sense to be so genuinely blind to the nonsense of others. Most people pretend to be candid, but you truly are. And what of Mr. Bingley's sisters? Do you like them as well?
Their manners aren't as easy as his. But once you converse with them, they are pleasing. Miss Bingley will live with her brother and keep his house. I think we may find a charming neighbor in her.
Elizabeth, ever observant, listened silently but remained unconvinced. She found the Bingley sisters proud and conceited, their airs calculated to impress, but their manners far from warm. The Bingley household, the sound of glasses clinking and low, genteel conversation. The history of the Bingley family reflected their station. Mr. Bingley had inherited nearly £100,000 from his father, whose fortune had come from trade. Though his sisters considered their family respectable, they rarely acknowledged its origins. Mr. Bingley's easy temper and openness endeared him to all, especially his closest friend, Mr. Darcy.
What a delightful assembly, such kind people, such pretty girls. I've never felt so welcomed.
I saw little beauty or fashion there. No one worth my attention except for Miss Bennet. She's pretty, but she smiles too much.
Oh, come now, Darcy, you cannot deny she's an angel. You must allow me my admiration.
A bustling atmosphere as Mrs. Bennet chats with her daughters. While Mr. Bingley admired Jane, his sisters deemed her a sweet girl, worthy of their acquaintance. Their approval bolstered Mr. Bingley's growing regard for her, much to Mrs. Bennet's delight.
Oh, Jane, to think the Bingley sisters called you sweet. And Mr. Bingley, he danced with you twice. Twice!
Yes, Mama, and he didn't even sprain his ankle during the first dance. How fortunate.
This could be the start of something wonderful. Jane, my dear, you must write to your aunt. She'll want to hear of this at once.
Closing scene, Elizabeth in her room, gazing out of the window. Though Mrs. Bennet's hopes soared, Elizabeth, ever more discerning, observed all with a mix of amusement and quiet skepticism. Only time would tell if Mr. Bingley's easy manners would blossom into something more substantial.